Hi everyone, it's Jess. Welcome back to my channel. I've been wanting to make this video for a while, just because I think it's really fun to be able to talk with friends about movies or books that you've enjoyed. And I think right now we're all especially kind of in extra need of conversation buddies or maybe recommendations for things to enjoy. I know I've been extra dependent on having a book by my side at all times. And I've also been able to just read a lot more and watch a lot more movies this month because I've been given so much more time. And yeah, I just thought I would share with you guys some things that I've been enjoying this month. So I'll start with music. As always, I make a playlist for every month. So May's playlist is already out now. And if you are interested at all in listening to it, I've included it in the description below the video. When I was originally building the playlist in April, I wanted a more melancholy and thoughtful kind of vibe, which is what I had going for the first few days. And then I kind of realized that I didn't really want to write off April as this only sad month, especially since usually April is really nice, and that's kind of when spring is. Near the end of the playlist, kind of the second half is more of a happy, celebratory songs that kind of fit that mood. So it's a little bit of a playlist with duality, I guess. But I think that's also the fun part about playlists is that you can kind of put whatever you want in it, and whatever resulting vibe you get out of it is completely your own, and it's completely up to you. So I think in the end, I'm pretty happy with it. Every time I listen through it, it seems to kind of fit the vibe of the month pretty well. That being said, I do have some highlights from the playlist that I wanted to share with you. The first one is If You're Too Shy, Let Me Know by the 1975. If you followed me for a while, you'll know that I'm a really big fan of them. I don't know, I feel like they've always been acclaimed since they started making music. I've also just really liked their music since I was in grade 9 or 10. This is one of their newer songs, I think. For one, it's such an upbeat, jammy song. The second song is All My Friends Are Falling in Love by the Vaccines. This is also kind of in the same vein, a really jammy and upbeat song. I really love it. Whenever it comes on, I think my mood always improves whenever it comes on. So I thought I'd balance out those two songs with two other ones that are kind of on the sadder side. They're more thoughtful in its sense. I think they're both, they can both described as really haunting, but I guess that's up to you when you listen to them. So the third one is River by Leon Bridges. And this one, I think I listened to it before, but it really made me reappreciate Leon Bridges' music. I think for one, his voice is really, really good. And everyone always says, oh, he has such an old soul and everything. But I think if you listen, you'd also describe it that way. I think you just have to listen to it. A lot of it is about forgiveness and for accepting each other, even though you're not perfect. Yeah, I think you really just have to listen to it. And the last one is Tenenbaum by the Paper Kites. This one I also really, really love. I think it's also super haunting. I remember I listened to, I think, a Mahogany Sessions version of it, where they played everything in this empty warehouse, and it was really, really, I don't know, it just hit different. And yeah, that's pretty much it for my song highlights. And I think what we're going to talk about next is, oh shit. Okay, so getting on into the books that I read this month. In April, I read 5 books. A Little Life, Red Rising, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, The BFG, and Matilda. So this month I actually read a lot more than I usually do. I think in last year in general, I read 7 books in total, which is not the best. And definitely not as much as I used to read in high school and before. I think now I'm definitely trying to take advantage of having more time to read for pleasure more. So the first book that I want to kind of talk about is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. I might just read the summary of this for you because every time I think about this book, I feel like I'm getting punched by 10 people at the same time. But it's essentially about 4 classmates from Massachusetts. So Willem, JB, Malcolm, and Jude. Much like the title, the book kind of documents their a very large portion of their lives. So from when they're around 20 to when they're around 50 years old. That's pretty much all I have to tell you about the book. They're kind of all, their paths cross multiple times throughout their lives, but in the end it's always Jude who is at the center of everything. I think if you want the summary, you can just go read it, or I can put it in the video maybe, but I'd rather just kind of talk about the things that I found really interesting. For one, I think Yanagihara's prose is really something. normally, or even when I was 16 and I tried to read this book and I couldn't get through it, I felt like there was something special about the prose itself. I think the way like she writes out words it's really captivating, and I think like partly why a lot of the things that happen in this book are so difficult to stomach. Oh, by the way, there are a lot of trigger warnings for this book, and if you are interested in reading it, I would definitely heed those for sure. She is, I think, really, really good at kind of crafting this really immediate imagery, and I think that serves its purpose really, really well when she's describing certain scenes, like especially the violent ones. At times, it's like really hard to continue reading without this like fear of either what's going to happen next or what kind of you're going to see on the page and won't be able to get out of your head. The graphic imagery aside, I think as well this is one of the, if not most, extremely emotional books that I've ever read. I don't think I've ever cried for a book unless you count like the Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants. But I think this was the only book that actually made me cry a lot. And I remember just in like part 6 and 7, I was just like on the couch and then I couldn't move for the rest of the day. Another thing after I finished reading the book, I went, like, even while I was reading, I was already obsessed with like how she was writing and how she was structuring everything, because it's not linear. And I'm like a huge sucker for non-linear stories. It's part of why I like movies like Inception so much and everything. But I was reading interviews that she did when she was like getting really famous after publishing A Little Life. And like one of the things she talked about was like how she had this kind of mood board for when she was writing it, and how she wanted like all of her like language to kind of take on the same tone as like the pictures that she had collected for the book. I think they're like around 20 or something. And I think maintaining that specific tone, I'll see if I can like maybe link one of the posts or something, maintaining that like really like normal at first, but then eventually like really like internal and dark tone is like really something. And I think that kind of perpetuates itself throughout the entire book, which is really interesting. And I think she does like a really, really good job of that. So she also mentioned in her book, no, not in her book, in her interviews, that had A Little Life been about, for women, that it probably would have been around 1/3 as long. And I thought that was really interesting, because I think one of the main sort of struggles that is like being brought back to over and over in the book is like one of the main characters' inability to like talk about the things that have happened to him. Kind of the whole thing around that is like how these 4 men are like basically this language that has like brought them together in the first place eventually like fails them, because they aren't able to like use it to properly connect like they did before. And I thought that was really interesting. I think generally her observations about how I think a lot of men don't physically have the language to talk about a lot of emotional things, which you can kind of see in like, for example, a lot of like teenage romance movies where the guy really can't say what he's feeling at all, and he literally cannot articulate that. I think that was like a really interesting thing to draw attention to and to focus on for so much of them. Okay, so that's it for A Little Life. On to the next novel, and I'm not going to talk about the other ones for as long, because I think Little Life had a really, really large impact on me. I felt like I felt super emotionally drained, but I also felt like exceedingly grateful for kind of the life that I have been given. And I think like the experience of reading it is really, really worthwhile if you are interested in reading it. But I would definitely look at, again, the trigger warnings. The next book I wanted to talk about was Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This one is more of a dystopian novel. I can't tell if it's young adult or adult, but it's set in space, specifically on Mars. And as with most like dystopian books, there's some kind of, like uprising where the main characters like fight the power and everything. And it like those themes are definitely there. But what I thought was definitely interesting were, for one, I think the world building was I think just very interesting. Kind of how the author set up like the political systems within the story, and how like every person had like a very set role, and they could not expect to kind of move beyond them. I thought that was, like, one, a relevant, but also really interesting take, especially with, like, the use of colors and everything. And I think what I also just really enjoyed in general was, for one, I find a lot of dystopian books kind of hit or miss with me because sometimes the main character is not as likable as we'd like them to be, which I think is fine. I don't think every main character has to be likable, but I think at least they have to be realistic, especially if they're written in first person. It kind of takes me out of a story when the narration doesn't really sound like a real human being, which I find that like a little bit irritating. For Red Rising, I thought that the main character was like well realized and he had like a decent amount of growth throughout the book. So I think I'm definitely going to read the following books in the series. I remember like once I got halfway, I actually couldn't stop. I was like mouthing the words aloud to myself when like some particularly gripping plot twist happened and everything. Okay, the next book is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. And I think this is the first book in the Blade Runner series, so that it's kind of the book that inspired the movies and everything. And it was published in like 1968, so I really don't understand how he had the presence of mind already, how many years, like 50 years ago, to come up with a sci-fi book that has like this much verisimilitude. Yeah, but I think generally all I have to say about it was that it was confusing but good. I think the biggest thing I enjoyed about this, other than the world building itself, and the commentary, was the writing style. I remember I saved a lot of quotes from this one because I felt like I had a lot to learn from how he kind of phrased sentences, and I think he develops voice quite well. It's interesting to look at. Particularly in this case, I felt like, especially when we were looking at characters that were like not the most intelligent, the narrator was like, it felt a little bit like they were poking fun at specific characters, which I thought was interesting and I always enjoy. I talked to one of my friends about this book later on when I heard that she had read it, and she's an English student, and she told me basically the author is actually like a philosopher, but he had to write this book for some reason, so when he did it, he just like took as many drugs as he could and then wrote the book. So that's why it's, I think, partly so confusing, which I thought was really interesting because at points it's like really coherent. And then at other points I didn't really understand what was going on, so I just kept reading. Okay, the next book I read was The BFG by Roald Dahl. I've been saying Roald for my entire life, but I recently looked it up and apparently it's Roald. I've been reading his books since I was really young, and I grew up having them read to me as well, so I think I'm never not going to have a soft spot for any of the stories he tells, but in particular, I think The BFG is one of my favorites. I just think, like one of the things that I find so charming is just like the way that The BFG talks in general. It's kind of how my brother used to talk to me when I was a kid, because he also grew up reading these books too. And I don't know, I think Dahl is just, when he writes, it's so charming that I feel like this is one of the only like authors that I can like always expect to smile while I'm reading his books. And I realized I never even talked about what the actual story is about. So this is a children's book, and it's about this girl named Sophie. I think she's like 6 years old. And one night she looks out her window and she sees like this huge giant peering into like the windows of some other like sleeping boys and girls. And then the story unfolds from there. It's a really grand story, and I think like part of why Dahl's books are so like magic for a lot of children and for a lot of people in general, I think they're still magic for me, is because they're so like subtly immersive. I don't really know how to describe it beyond that. I think like even though the things he's saying are like really magical and a little bit beyond imagination, they're still, I think, rather than believable, I think it's more like you wish they were real and you kind of cling to that. So yeah, anyway, now you know that I love The BFG. And the last book that I read this month was Matilda, also by Roald Dahl. And I think this book definitely is, if like, my favorite of his books. I think it's a toss-up between this one and The BFG. I think it's like as close to magic, I think, as you can get for a children's book. I mean, it kind of does have magic in it, but I just really love it. Well, it's about this 5-year-old girl named Matilda, and she's like this really like precocious child. She's really smart and she loves to read, and kind of what she gets up to at school and like within her life, and basically how she uses her smarts to kind of get through life, because like her parents are not the nicest, and she's not like put into the best school either. So I think because her circumstances are not that great, like her parents are like really, they couldn't be bothered with her at all, and the headmistress of her school is like really scary and out to get her essentially. I don't know how much more of this children's book I can tell you without completely revealing the story, so I won't. But yeah, I just really enjoy the style. I think it's just, I don't think there's any other word to describe it except for charming. I think it's just so unbelievably charming that like one, you have to keep reading, and two, you like have a very good time while you're doing it. Okay, finally moving on to movies that I watched this month. So I watched, I think, also 5 movies, and they actually all ended up being foreign movies, which is interesting. I like to watch like a good mix between like English movies and foreign ones, but I think this month I just ended up watching like all foreign movies for some reason, which is fine. So the first movie I will talk about will be The Classic, which is directed by Kwak Jae-young. And I think this one it's like a really, I think, more or less standard love story, which is why I don't have too much to say about it, because I thought it was okay. It wasn't like, I'm not like too big a fan of these, especially ones that are like only romance stories, but what I did have to say was I think it like kind of captured the idea of being young really well, which I thought was nice. It really feels like you're seeing the world through, like it just becomes like a lot more beautiful, I think, when you're in love, and I think that was kind of captured really, really well. I mean, I think you can see it in like almost all the scenes where they're like really lovingly constructed and everything kind of looks like a painting, which is kind of similar to Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which I will talk about later. But yeah, so there's that. And then I think the only other thing that I really enjoyed was that they just had a really charming score during the movie. And I forgot to talk about what the movie was about again. Okay, so essentially the main character, I don't remember her name, but she's played by Song Ye-jin. And while she's like clearing out her house, she finds like a bunch of letters, like love letters to her mom from like her mom's like kind of boyfriend, and then she like rediscovers their entire love story while her own is taking place. And yeah, that's basically what the movie is about. And I remember one of the scenes that kind of really stuck with me was when they were all, I think they had like a dance class, which was really interesting. And then they were supposed to be learning like ballroom or something, and then someone suddenly played like this old, I think 50s rock and roll song, and then everyone started dancing. I thought that was just like really fun, and it just really felt like what it feels like to be kind of like young and uninhibited. So I thought that was nice. Overall, it's a really nice movie. The second one that I want to talk about is And Then We Danced, directed by Levon Atkin. And this one is about this dancer who basically wants to move up to the main group in a dance company. And then what happens is like this new guy comes and he becomes like his rival, and he also falls in love with him. So I think what I wanted to talk about mostly with this one was, like, one, I thought it was really interesting how almost all of it was shot on handheld, and all of it was like, I don't think there was like a single still scene in the entire movie, which was really interesting. And it felt like, I think also this film does a good job of capturing kind of like what it feels like to kind of be young, where nothing is like in place or stable or still for even a moment. And then, I mean, after, like, while I was watching, I was just like writing down every like super powerful image, or like every image that really spoke to me, because like afterwards I wrote like 3 poems about it. But I think one of the things that, like, generally, like, everything, the shakiness, I think the actors as well, and the score was, all of it was just, like, really intense. And I think, like, intenseness lends itself well to poetry in general, but I find, as well, just, like, the colors and, like, the specific things that the director focused on, I think they all made for, like, really good pieces of inspiration that just, like, really wanted to capture down when I was, like, collecting inspiration for my poems. Yeah. And then I thought they did, like, a fair amount of, like, political discussion as well. It's, like, not super explicit, but I thought it was kind of interesting how they were tackling, like, identity, like, within a culture, which is kind of vague, and I get that, like, most movies do that. But anyway, moving on. The next movie is Tiger Tail, directed by Alan Yang. I remember I really wanted to watch this after I saw the trailer because I thought it looked, like, so poignant and beautiful and everything, but actually after I watched it, I was, like, a little bit disappointed. The story is about, I can't remember anyone's names, but the story is about this like, young man in Taiwan, and essentially he moves to the US to kind of pursue his dream with this girl that he barely knows, and then they also, like, start a family, and he kind of, like, the story goes back and forth between where he's kind of thinking about his first love that he left behind in Taiwan, and kind of his fractured life now in the US, and, like, his relationship with his daughter and everything. I don't know, it kind of all, like, all of this sets itself up to be, or what I thought sets itself up for what I thought was going to be, like, a really, like, touching and kind of present story, but I feel like it just fell flat a little bit with the execution, which is fine. It's, like, a debut movie. Yeah, I think at parts where it was kind of trying to go for, like really emotionally wrenching moments, it kind of fell flat a little bit, and I think, like, the whole story, there were, like, certain parts that didn't feel complete, which is probably why it didn't feel, like, as emotionally fulfilling. But yeah, those are my thoughts. The next movie I watched was In the Mood for Love, directed by Wong Kar-wai. This one I think is a classic and one that most people have heard of, so I feel like I don't really have to explain too much of the plot, but essentially two neighbors find out that their spouses are having an affair with each other, and then it's kind of the resulting story from that. I think, this one I think I really, really enjoyed because I actually studied it earlier, like 2 years ago for a film class where I was comparing, like, how romance is portrayed in different cultures, and this was, like, the Eastern component of it. And I remember one of the things that I talked about was, like, how interesting the composition of it was. I feel like in almost every scene, the two characters are, like, within a frame of some kind. So maybe they're framed by, like, a really tight hallway, or between a door, or, like, in between rooms, or through a window or something. So they're always kind of trapped within, like, the workings of, like, society. And that's also kind of, they kind of spend the whole movie being trapped, basically. And then I think on top of that, just, like, the soundtrack and the coloring and everything is just, like, so divine, and it makes everything so intimate, and I don't know, I just really enjoyed it. I think if you are looking for a movie to watch out of the ones that I talked about, this would definitely be one of the top ones I would recommend. And the last movie that I watched that I want to talk about was Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which is directed by Celine Sciamma. And this one is about a painter she's essentially hired to paint this girl who doesn't really want to get married, and basically she has to do it without letting the other girl know that she's painting her, so she has to just, like, observe her at points and then, like, remember it and then paint it later when she goes back, which is just, like, the very bare bones of the story, but I don't want to tell too much. I think the interesting things I wanted to talk about for this movie was, I think, just in general, how everything looks. Essentially, the movie itself is about painting and, like, the collaboration between, like, these two main characters and how, like, they together created art. but as well, just like every single frame looks really like it looks like an oil painting, and I think it's just so beautiful. And I think if you are like a fan of art, that you should definitely at least check it out a bit. And on top of how everything looks, I mean, I think you can tell from the title, which is Portrait of a Lady on Fire, that fire is very important. And it kind of reappears throughout as a motif. And in the beginning, I kind of wasn't sure about what it was or anything. But basically, every time it appeared, I was like, wow, this is poetic cinema. I think it was... Actually, let me just look at my notes. I mean, I don't quite know what it means, but I think, like, in general, it kind of appeared whenever it was kind of intense, but I feel like they drew attention to fire a lot, and it was, like, always in the scenes. I think probably it has something to do with, like, their developing feelings and kind of how, like, consuming it can be, for sure. I think what I also found really interesting was the dialogue itself, and also kind of the lack of it. It's actually a very quiet movie as a whole. I think for the score, there are only like two songs, and they're both like produced within the movie itself. So like one of them is like a choral song that's like performed by a bunch of people, and the other one is like an orchestra playing the song that the two characters talked about earlier on in the film. And that's like pretty much it. And then when it came to actual dialogue, it was really I don't know if robust is the right word, but like very like there weren't any like big speeches or monologues or anything. I think a lot of the story was like kind of left with what was unsaid, and I think that kind of fit very well overall with the whole feeling of like painting and how everything like that had to do with like the creation of art and everything was. Okay, I lost my train of thought, but essentially I thought that the lack of dialogue, or like the simpleness of the dialogue, was interesting, and kind of how it all tied in together with like, you know, the creation of art. And like eventually they collaborated on the final piece, but we didn't really care. Like, we don't actually care about what the painting ended up looking like. But yeah, overall, I also really enjoyed this one. I think it's definitely worth a watch. Anyway, I think it was a really good like month as a whole for media in general and for media consumption in general. I think I like enjoyed pretty much everything that I watched and read. So if you are like perhaps watching this video because you're looking for new things to enjoy, then I would definitely recommend checking out one of the things that I've mentioned. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So as always, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful week and that you stay safe and healthy, and I will see you next time.